we've been talking about here in this wonderful conference, and particularly with the themes of this panel. So with that, I'd like to welcome you all here for this panel, Can Trade Be for All? In particular, I'd like to acknowledge the Cook Island High Commissioner, Her Excellency Elizabeth Wright Koteka, Kia ora ngā katoa. And we also have diplomatic representatives from Tuvalu, Puaita Etiwati, from Fiji, Josua Tuere, and from Vanuatu, Saniana Treef. And so to these and all our many honoured guests, we welcome you. No mai haere mai ki tēnei hui. So as we can see, I have next to me the three panellists. My name is Damon Salesa. I'm the Pro-Vice Chancellor here at the University of Auckland. Next to me I have Lucian Cernat, who is the Chief Trade Economist from the European Commission. Alongside him we have Steph Honey, who is with Honey Consultants and is a trade policy consultant. And on the far end in the red, I have my colleague from here at the University of Auckland, Professor Jane Kelsey. So the format for this session is quite simple. We're going to begin just working our way along the panel here, and each one of our panelists is going to have 12 minutes to opine on this, basically to respond to the new policy, which I think everyone in this room is aware of, in progress, Trade for All. After that 12 minutes each, at about 40 minutes, then we're going to turn over to the floor. And if there is a mass exodus at 2:35, it's because this session is running up against the All Blacks versus versus Tonga, sorry. And it's in Hamilton, so most of the people who are actually going to the game are already gone.
And we lose the chair?
No, the chair is so devoted to this cause. He gave up tickets for Hamilton. Yes. I was told there's a massive traffic jam which runs from here to Hamilton. So, too late, guys. So with that, I welcome Lucian Cernat.
All right. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank my friends in MFAT and here at the university. I'm privileged to have friends in both organizing institutions, and I'm very glad to be here, thanks to their invitation. I'm also very glad to share with you some of our lessons learned and experiences in Europe with Trade for All, which is a title that we also share with you in Europe. But I think we share a lot more than the title of our current trade strategy. We have common values and common objectives. So beyond these commonalities, I think there are also probably differences and, as I said, lessons learned that maybe are not very familiar to each other. So I am here not just to share with you some of the lessons learned in Europe, but also to learn as much as I can from your own experiences with making trade an inclusive policy and spreading the benefits of trade policy to all society, basically. So what I wanted to do, since Trade for All, at least in Europe, covers a wide range of issues, and I will mention very briefly some of them, I'd like, in the second part of my intervention, to focus on one element which is extremely important and has been highlighted as becoming even more important in the inaugural speech in the European Parliament by the President-elect of the European Commission. And that element is linked to the ability of the European institution and policy instruments to deal with those people who may be negatively affected by trade, globalization, and beyond. There are many things we have in Europe that are linked to this, but there's one that is center stage in this debate, and its own name is linked to globalization. It's called the European Globalization Fund. I'm curious, raise your hand if you heard about it before. Oh, just as many hands as in Brussels. Not many, meaning just very few. So that's one of the problems with this fund, and I will get to that in a second. But let me very quickly cover the full waterfront of what would be important elements in our own version of Trade for All in Europe. I would, as I said, focus on the most important things. I think the strategy that we have, the trade strategy that is actually coming to an end now, because we are at the end of the political cycle at the European Commission, and we will start a new one. This strategy came about as a response to a number of criticisms that were addressed to the European trade policy in recent years. And they were, to a large extent, I think, personally based on misconceptions and misinformation, but some of them are actually true. So we try to respond to the truth in those criticisms and trying to put in place elements to address them. But just to give you an example, for instance, we've been systematically criticized over the last few years that EU trade policy is actually an instrument that benefits the happy few, just a handful of large exporters, mainly multinationals, and then as such, it's a policy that increases economic inequalities in Europe. So we had to actually invest quite a lot to debunk that myth and actually show with clear hard facts, with statistics, that that's not the case, that the vast majority of our exporters are actually small and medium enterprises. It's almost 90% of our exporters in Europe, and we're talking about over 750,000 companies, are actually SMEs. They generate more than a third of our exports, so it's just not just peanuts in terms of the value that they generate out of it. So that's one example. So SMEs, the importance of trade for a large number of small firms that most people, including academics actually, thought that they wouldn't benefit from trade, whereas in reality they do, was one of these key priorities for the current Trade Commissioner, Cecilia Malmström. The other blind spot, if I could call it that way, in the trade policy, but also in the way we communicate and we do trade policy, was consumers. I mean, if you say trade should benefit all individuals, I mean, after all, the best way for you to benefit from trade policy is as a consumer. Not all of us would have a business, not all of us would be in a company as workers or employees of a company that is an exporting firm or an importing firm. But if you are a retired person, you'll still benefit from trade because you consume imported products. And we didn't do much to showcase the benefits of trade and trade policy in particular for consumers. We take it for granted because we think it's true based on economic theory, but in terms of actually quantifying, showcasing the benefits for consumers, we thought we underinvested over time. So there was a renewed focus on showcasing the benefits for consumers, including through consumer protection, not just lower prices, but also guaranteeing consumer safety, quality, etc. So that was the second most important thing for us to guarantee that we are mindful and put in place instruments in the trade policy. And then if you are in a political environment, you will soon realize that if you want to be convincing and if you want to grab the attention of your audience when you talk about trade policy, the best way to do it is to say trade means jobs, jobs, jobs. So that was the third pillar, main pillar in our Trade for All strategy, to actually document, again, with hard facts and figures, that at least in Europe, trade policy is an important driver for economic prosperity and for the way we try to sustain good quality jobs with a social welfare system around them. So we invested quite a bit in creating this evidence to prove that trade and trade policy in particular supports a growing number of jobs in Europe. And it's been a great success. I think it's probably the most cited and the most influential figure that I managed to produce in the last few years. The number of jobs supported by trade in Europe. We have 36 million jobs in Europe supported by trade. It's a figure that no Commission official who goes to the Parliament fails to cite if it's necessary. But then there was another issue where we were asked questions and initially we didn't have a very good answer, which was, okay, fine, you've told us that exports are good for job creation in Europe, but how about imports? How many jobs did we lose because we've just imported so much from China, people would say. So analytically speaking, the economists in the room will soon understand how difficult that question is for one to quantify job losses linked to a particular increase or a particular level of imports for many reasons. First, because imports are not necessarily destroying jobs. If you are a company that needs a good quality ratio, price quality ratio for inputs, you depend on imports in order to export in the first place. And then it turns out that some of these imports would be probably impossible for us to produce in Europe in any case. It's very hard to use your minister's example. It's very hard to do bananas in Brussels. So it's not so easy to, if you want to be intellectually honest and analytically robust, to actually come up with a number. And we were very humble and said, we don't have such a number. But then we have something else, which is probably much better than a number, which is an instrument. We know for a fact that some people may actually temporarily be in between two jobs simply because as a result of imports, one company went bust or had to lay off people. I mean, that's a fact. You don't benefit from trade if you are not allowing your resources to be allocated to the most efficient way of production. So you have to admit there will be temporary cost for your economy. The question is, how do you deal with them? So we came up with a very clear political answer more than 10 years ago, and it's this little known fund called the European Globalization Fund, which is only one instrument among many that we have in Europe to deal with people who are unemployed. But why is this instrument so important in my view? It's important because of its symbolics. It has the name of the problem that people try to address in the first place. It's a European Globalization Fund. So globalization, whenever it has unintended negative consequences, we've got the money to deal with it. Then people say, well, why do you need a European Globalization Fund? Especially our member states from the north, they have an excellent social security system, and they say, well, we have our own Finnish way of dealing with unemployment. Why would we need one European fund? And the answer is, again, at least in our case, very simple. The European Union currently has 28 member states, and they share a common trade policy. In other words, each member state has relinquished to a large extent its ability to conduct independent trade policy on its own, and it's all done collectively with member states' approval and endorsement and checks and balances in Brussels. So when we sign a free trade agreement with Vietnam, and as a result of that agreement, let's assume for a second that 1,000 female workers in the Portuguese textile garment industry will lose their jobs, but 20 other companies in Sweden, Finland, Germany, and France will benefit because they will export the telecom equipment to Vietnam. Basically, do you think we should tell the Portuguese government, you deal with your mess by yourself because we created economic benefits in Sweden, Finland, and Germany? That won't be solidarity. So if we have a common commercial policy, I think we have a common instrument to deal with all the consequences of that instrument. So what we achieved so far, and it's been one, as I said, in the President-elect speech, is one of the key priorities to continue and strengthen this fund. We actually managed to support more than 150,000 people to go back to the labor market with a success rate of 60%. The vast majority of them are in full employment, permanent full employment. They're as satisfied, if not more satisfied, with the new job than the old job. And on average, we spend 4,000 euros per worker to get back in employment. So these are some key facts to show you that, at least in Europe, maybe in other countries, and I know that in the US, the TAA is not always so successful, but in Europe, I think the evidence suggests that when we have the proper instruments in place, and if they are implemented together with member states and with stakeholders, trade unions and local authorities, it actually allows us to be open and to say, look, in case as a result of a free trade agreement we have negative consequences, we also give ourselves the means to deal with those. So this is just to give you a very concrete example of how we take trade for all seriously in all aspects. I could talk more, but I don't have time. We also have a very important angle on trade and women in trade, in case you're interested in gender and trade aspects, but I can take that in the Q&A if you are interested. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Lucian. I'd like to give a New Zealand perspective, but I should stress these are just my own opinions. I know Professor Kelsey will also give a sort of a New Zealand view, if you like. But overall, I think, it's interesting to be having this discussion now, but in terms of the New Zealand discourse, of course, we will soon see the results of the Trade for All Advisory Board's work, and it will be very interesting to see what they've come up with and how the government might respond. But I thought it would be useful to start with just a little bit of global context, because, you know, this conference is about disruption and disruptors, but one of the sort of disruptive forces, I guess you could say, that we've seen in the last few years has been this increasing emphasis on inclusive and sustainable growth. And of course, a lot of the big pieces of trade architecture have long had an emphasis on development and trade and development, but this term inclusion or inclusive growth has really only come to the forefront in the last few years. And now we're seeing even very traditional institutions like the WTO and the OECD doing work looking at these issues. It's been quite a strong theme in APEC over many years, but you know, it's really part of the public policy discourse. And I would say we're just at the very early stages of it. I mean, in the WTO, for example, there has been a declaration on women's economic empowerment. There's a group of WTO members that are starting to look at SME issues. But really, it's the first stage in a journey. I think there's a lot of work that we collectively, globally need to do to understand the data and the issues and think of the solutions. And I guess overall my sort of messages for you today are that the answers to getting more inclusive growth are not easy, but it's really important to try for reasons which I'll explain. I think, you know, happily coinciding with the themes of the speakers earlier in the conference, digital and services are really important elements for success, but so is getting rid of trade barriers. But above all, domestic policy is a really important ingredient in inclusive growth. And I think, you know, the interesting quandary for the trade negotiators in the room is the extent to which some of these issues can actually be addressed in a sort of a trade negotiation sense as opposed to a sort of domestic policy setting. So just very briefly to recap, how did New Zealand get to this embrace for the concept of inclusive growth or inclusive trade? Well, as the Minister and Vangelis said yesterday, you know, it's really sprung out of concerns about inequality, but also public disquiet over trade. So I think, you know, economists in the room would agree that overall, in aggregate, trade has been a force for global economic development. Again, in aggregate, we've seen inequality be reduced across countries since the multilateral trading system came into effect. But we've also seen, and this has become very visible in recent years, inequality within a lot of economies growing. Now, not uniformly, and that goes to my point that domestic policy settings really matter in this space. But, you know, there's definitely been a sense of sort of public disquiet about whether trade actually works for everyday people and whether the benefits of trade have been shared. And that, I think, has driven the government to look into this. I think it's also worth bearing in mind, of course, that trade is not an end in itself. It is, as Lucian said, you know, it's about jobs and better living standards for our communities. And I'm sure that that's an underpinning of the way that the Trade for All Advisory Board is going to look at it. So I think also, as Lucian said, you know, the story about the benefits of trade hasn't been told very well. But it's not just that we need to tell the story better. We do also need to have a better story to tell. And I think there are some things that can be done in the trade space that will help with that. But also, and this is something, you know, perhaps peculiar to New Zealand, there are two other very strong drivers for trying to get the answers in this space. And they are also things that we've talked about so far. The economic and trade performance of a small and distant economy like New Zealand, but also the sort of times of trade turmoil that we're heading into. So on the first one, New Zealand is uniquely small and distant. There are lots of comparators that are small economies, so Scandinavian economies or some of the ASEAN economies, but they have the benefit of big markets on their doorstep. There are also remote economies like Australia, but they have the advantage of big home markets. But New Zealand has the double whammy of being small and being remote. And so despite the amazing efforts of negotiators like Vangelis and all of his predecessors, New Zealand has found it very hard to move the dial on the share of exports and trade in our GDP. And despite the great suite of FTAs that we have, and I think trying to get more small businesses or women or the Māori economy or the regions involved in trade is maybe one way that we can try to shift that dial. And, you know, when you look at the potential, it's definitely worth trying. SMEs are 97% of our business entities. Now, I think a quick note, Lucian and I were talking about this last night, the sort of international benchmark for an SME is fewer than 250 employees. Well, in New Zealand, we believe in tiddlers. Most of our SMEs have fewer than 20 employees and a lot, and then there are some medium-sized ones that are fewer than 50. So, you know, if we could even just get a fraction of those guys into trade, that will have some benefits. At the moment, the figures, we've got about 500,000 SMEs. They account for about a third of employment, but only about a quarter of them export at the moment. A lot of them are very reluctant about going further. So there was a survey that was done last year, I think it was, by the New Zealand Small Business Council as part of its work trying to help the government to devise a new SME strategy. It's not hugely scientific. The participants were self-selected, so you can question how representative it is, but it's got some interesting and quite sobering numbers. Only 4% of the 1,000 companies they surveyed had as a goal for the next 5 years to grow by exporting. Only 7% of those seeking financing wanted it to export, and only 5% identified exporting as an area they'd like to learn about. So I think, you know, we need to obviously sell the story of trade to those, or persuade them that there's something in it for them. And of course, you know, the story is not just about growing export revenues, because all the economists in the room would agree exposure to international competition and acting in international markets has huge benefits of productivity and competitiveness and innovation and capital investment and so on. For women, also huge potential there. About a third of global SMEs are owned by women, but only 1 in 5 exporting firms. And the work that's been done looking at this, although this is really an area where we need a lot more data to understand the complexities, the McKinsey Global Institute has estimated that if we could get full gender empowerment to the highest possible standard, that could add $28 trillion to global GDP by 2025. Now, even if you cut that number in half, or even 10% of it, that's surely worth having. I should stress that's not just about trade, but all global, but all economic empowerment. And I think, you know, as I said, the work that's been done looking at the New Zealand situation, for instance, NZIER has done some work on the tradable sector. Those firms employ more, are more productive, more competitive, more innovative. So for the good of our domestic economy, we should do that too. And then the last driver is really about resilience, because as we've heard very depressingly for the last day, you know, we're heading into some stormy waters, and to try and get greater resilience, it's important to, you know, try to broaden and hedge our bets. We're at a time of rising protectionism, not just the trade war, but Global Trade Alerts has done some great analysis. 680 new trade restrictive measures in the last year, less than a quarter of those from China and the US. And for small companies, uncertainty and non-tariff barriers and trade barriers fall disproportionately heavily. So what do we do about it? Well, I mean, the first thing to know is it's very hard to export. I don't know if there are any exporters in the room, but it's a really challenging activity. And SMEs in particular find it very difficult. It's well known in the literature. The barriers are things like business readiness, access to financing, access to information about markets, but also trade requirements, challenges around connecting to networks and connecting in markets to distribution channels, trade capacity, being able to understand and meet trade requirements and trade costs. And of course, for women, there are also big challenges around legal discrimination in lots of markets, but gendered social norms and sort of cultural practices as well. Now, New Zealand doesn't actually do too badly on some of those metrics. We're very good at, you know, doing business. We're not bad on gender discrimination. We have great digital infrastructure under the Digital Trade Restrictiveness Index that Hozuki Makiyama's think tank has done. We are the best in the world for digital trade restrictiveness. We're not bad on access to financing, but we're still not really performing. So what can we do? Now, I think the digital revolution, it holds part of the answers. Obviously, micro multinationals can be born global. Their very first customers can be on the other side of the world. It significantly reduces trade costs and those challenges about the tyranny of distance and so on for New Zealand firms, for SMEs, for Māori, for regions. E-commerce survival rates for SMEs are much higher than other small businesses. So, you know, there's something there, but we've got to get the policy settings right. So that's some of the big issues like data flows and tariffs on electronic transmission, but even the more tedious details like e-signatures, fintech, digital trade facilitation, all of those digital non-tariff barriers are important to helping small businesses. There's also a really important piece about access to information, and New Zealand has made a very good start on that. We led the way, MFAT did, with the digital tariff finder, the website. They're working on doing something similar for services. Under the CPTPP agreement, it's been agreed that all the parties should set up websites for information, but it's not enough just to have it available. Companies also need help to understand what that actually means and how to put it into practical effect. And for Māori, there are obviously, as we heard yesterday in one of the questions, some really significant issues around IP and cultural taonga as well. Now, I think we haven't got it right yet, or perfect yet. As I said, it's the first stage in a journey, and particularly in some trade agreements, the provisions for women and the provisions for Indigenous trade are, well, let's say, to be polite, pretty underwhelming. It's useful to shine a light and it's useful to share experiences, but I think the clever people in this room really need to put their thinking caps on about practical tools that will actually help. Why don't we see more women and more Māori on business missions? Why don't we see more provisions in government procurement and trade agreements that, you know, take an active step towards enhancing the abilities of those underserved communities to participate? Why don't we see the institutional pressure of those sort of confidence building and cooperative mechanisms in FTAs actually keeping feet to the fire? But to finish, domestic policy is also really key. Business has a really important role in helping, but so does the government, and doing things like capacity building, putting in place networks to help small businesses and women and Māori is really key. And just to finish, because I'm past time, Suzanne's looking angrily at me, I guess my sort of Pollyanna-ish message is that trade is really powerful and it's a really strong force for good in the world. We need to keep doing it, but we've got to do it better than we have been. We've got to be smarter about it. And to me, the recipe for success for small businesses and women and Māori is we've got to prioritise getting rid of those trade barriers, NTBs, tariffs, regulatory barriers to services. We've got to get the digital trade policy settings right, and we need to work on the policies at home as well. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou, ki ngā tangata whenua o Tāmaki mā kaurau, Ngāti Whātua o Ōrāke, tēnā koutou, e ngā iwi o ngā hoi whā, tēnā koutou. As the sole dissident speaker in the entire program, I have been listening very carefully, and I will try to do a mixture of responding to what I see as some of the misunderstandings and caricatures of the critique of the current model, and then to present some positive perspectives. So the four issues that I want to address is firstly to make it very clear that those of us who are critics of the current international trade and regulatory regime are not anti-trade, and it makes us extremely cross to be described as being hostile to trade or anti-trade. It is the neoliberal model of trade agreements, and in particular the abuse of the term trade to cover a wide range of non-trade regulatory issues, from intellectual property issues to internet governance, to issues on domestic regulation of services which do not belong in trade agreements. And that is the fundamental basis, certainly, of my critique. And I'll discuss these in a little more detail. The second point is that it's not that you're not telling the story well enough. It's not that people don't understand the benefits as you see them. It's that people don't see the agreements in the same way that you do, especially those who perceive themselves on the negative end of those agreements. They don't want to be told more through show and tell stories and little tours around the country by officials explaining what a good job they're doing. They want to be heard and they want to discuss alternatives. Third, this is not about Trump. The attempt to say that the turbulence that we are confronting is because of the problems of a rather idiosyncratic and malignant symptom of a problem in a regime is not enough. Getting rid of him is not going to get rid of the problems. And in particular, the complexities of the problems which run longer and deeper and are systemic. And the fourth point that I want to cover is that we need to be thinking about the future, not just defending the past, and looking at the future as slotted into the existing model. The challenges of the future, in particular when we're dealing with climate change, when we're dealing with digital disruption, when we're dealing with the systemic inequalities, and as the Minister said, again, the issues around the 1%, we need to be thinking about how to do what we're doing differently, not digging ourselves deeper into the trenches. So let me unpack this a little further. When we have been, and by we here I mean a wide range of communities, from health professionals to small business people to Māori to workers and unionists and local community workers, have been critiquing these developments. The problem is that Trade for All focuses on the trade and then looks at how to fit the all into the trade. It doesn't start with the all and then look at what the model of trade has to be to work for the all. So when the Minister said yesterday, the ultimate objective is to put people at the centre of the thinking in our policy, that doesn't mean simply finding ways to slot gender and SMEs and Māori into a pre-existing system. It means rethinking what a people-centred approach to trade agreements might look like. And I'll talk very shortly about an attempt we had to do that. But it's not that people don't understand. People want to engage. We had a hui in October last year in this whale on what an alternative trade strategy for New Zealand would look like. Over 2 days, we live streamed, over 2 days we had 17,000 page views. That is a heck of a lot of people wanting to engage with those questions. Yeah? But there is a real frustration. So when we see, for example, the Trade for All development, whether it was the website that MFAT ran, which was basically how great MFAT is and what comments do you have about that, or the Trade for All board, which is, if I look at the composition, the resourcing, the duration, the methodology, is fundamentally flawed. And we are told that it will only produce high-level outcomes which are not going to make the slightest bit of difference to what you guys in MFAT do. Now, it's certainly not making any difference to what you're doing now. So these discussions are continuing in this board whilst you're continuing to negotiate agreements as usual. I suppose I'm particularly jaundiced because I was invited to come and speak to the board on the 3rd of October when it's going to deliver its final report at the end of October. So for those of us who want to actually play an active role in these processes, it's extremely frustrating. The secrecy that continues is extremely frustrating. I mentioned yesterday one example of it, where we got information from Chile that I then went back to the ministry and said, this negotiation is supposed to be concluded in November. There's nothing on the website that tells us anything about the rounds you've had or what's being negotiated. And yesterday morning, finally, something appeared on the website that actually was the document from Chile. There are several other documents. We know that, for example, there have been discussions in the Pacific Alliance context about an Indigenous trade chapter. I've tried under the Official Information Act to get information on that, and we can't. Now, we shouldn't be going under the Act to try to get this material. Māori shouldn't have to go under the Act to get this material. If we have an inclusive process, then we need to be starting to have a level of openness that's respectful and engaging, that trusts us to talk about the issues that affect us. So let me just, in the remaining couple of minutes, talk about what Trade for All, if it's people-centred, might mean. When I was in Buenos Aires for the ministerial meeting there, we got, for example, the day before the issue of the Declaration on Women, we got a copy and we sent it around to women's groups internationally. In 24 hours, we had 160 women's groups signing on to a statement saying, we do not want to be mainstreamed into a system that we consider is toxic to us. Access to medicines, affordable access to medicines, impacts of small women farmers, impacts on domestic economies that push women into remittance migration, impacts on government revenue that impact on the funding for services that is available for communities. These are real issues for women. A few more entrepreneurs getting into the system is not going to address those questions. So if we're looking at gender, then we have to look at those questions. What were some of the positive suggestions that came out from our hui last year? Ngāti Whātua, who opened yesterday, reminded us that they have always been, as tangata whenua, traders. But traders based on relationships, not on rules negotiated in secret. We have Margaret Mutu from Ngāti Kahu saying, we have a great relationship with a Chinese investor there. We kicked the previous one out because they didn't respect us. These ones are here on our terms. It's a treaty-based relationship. They know they are there on our tikanga. They are there to respect our rangatiratanga. That is what we see as a constructive relationship. We had Jesse Chalmers from Tonzu Tofu, who says, we're trying to pay a living wage. We are integrated into our community. They are our suppliers. We are fundamentally important to our communities, yet we get no support from these kind of agreements. These agreements are hostile to us. And even when we have imports coming in that supposedly have standards around them, no one's testing them. And so we can't compete as sustainable local SMEs. Bernard Hickey said, we have a real problem in newsroom and the mainstream media doing fourth estate because all the advertising money's going off to Google. So how are we going to deal with that? The Southern Initiative people in South Auckland said, how do we use government procurement to be able to do living wage that's going to support jobs in the local community? The agreements are not looking at how we can do that in local and central government. So often we're criticised for being negative. Right? We're negative about the system as it is failing. And we do not want to see you, in the name of dealing with Trump, digging us deeper into that system. The time is right to look at doing things differently, to put people at the centre, and I would invite the next year's school to look at the issues that haven't been on the table here that are the future issues. The issues of inequality, the issues of businesses on the ground doing business, the place of Māori, not just Māori businesses, but the place of Māori, the place of workers, and the issue that is the elephant in the room that no one has addressed here, which is climate change. Kia ora koutou.
Kia ora. If we could just give our three panellists a hand, please. Okay, so the floor is now open for questions. I also have the Slido questions in front of me, so I'll interpolate questions. There is a mic going around, as you know, so if you can indicate if you wish to ask a question. Okay, given that there isn't a question here, I'll ask one from Slido. How can trade for all be better utilised to benefit communities and countries that rely on development aid? How can they be brought into trade for all?
Right. Thank you for that question. Maybe I could address one or two issues that have been raised by the other speakers before. The trade for all, at least the few things I mentioned, of course, I couldn't be exhaustive, and I didn't mean to belittle the importance of climate change in the current and the future, and especially the future EU trade policy. But I thought that from the angle of this panel, it's important to look more at the social rather than the environmental issues. But just to be very clear, we in Europe treat both of them equally. The fact that I didn't mention them, there is not to be implied that they're not important. Now, on the very question of trade and development, I think that's a very pertinent question in the sense that at least, as I said, the trade for all strategy that introduced some new innovative features in EU trade policy were predominantly linked to domestic issues. When it comes to EU trade policy trying to be a positive force for development around the world, that has been part of our DNA for a long time. So we did not have too much to reinvent in that area. But what is clear for us for a long time in terms of our involvement in development aid, the EU, it's still the biggest donor collectively. If we look at the amount of money that we allocate to this important area. What is important, I think, when it comes to development and trade is to try to understand what kind of policies and initiatives are mutually supportive of the two goals. And we have, for instance, in Geneva, at WTO, we have the Aid for Trade. There are many concrete initiatives where once you have in place the local support of the beneficiary country willing to use development aid to better integrate themselves into the global trading system. If you look at the annual reviews of Aid for Trade, you will see that there are plenty of success stories. And I think in that regard, trade and development can go hand in hand. But I could probably take some more concrete examples. But to me, the fact that development aid goes beyond trade, while in many cases using trade as a source of economic prosperity, it's well established.
Well, I would agree. I think in our own neighbourhood, in the Pacific, there have been, examples where the capacity building, for example, under the PACER Plus agreement, there's a big emphasis on building up the ability of those communities to be able to take advantage of the opportunities offered by trade. But also, as I said in my earlier remarks, I do think that the digital revolution has huge promise for lots of developing countries, but including our most sort of vulnerable Pacific neighbours, because it gives individuals in those countries the opportunity to actually have global reach and access markets without lots of the costs that have been, a barrier to them in the past, and particularly so, I guess, in the digitally provided services space, where the trade can actually take place without needing to meet some of the transaction costs of goods trade. I do also think that my earlier comments as well about getting rid of trade barriers are very apposite for these economies too, because, just as for small companies, the cost of trade barriers are very high, so they are for small economies too. And I think there's a really positive story to be told there. And I think the digital transformation that we've heard about from Professor Baldwin and others earlier does really allow lots of these economies to leapfrog some of the structural rigidities and old models. We heard from an audience member earlier about the potential for digital trade to help those businesses in that country. But as well as that, I last year went to Papua New Guinea for an APEC meeting, and I heard a very interesting presentation from the central bank governor there. Papua New Guinea has a very significant challenge around financial services. Only 8% of the population has a bank account, but blockchain-based financial services and mobile technology is actually allowing lots of that unbanked population to participate in economic activity and use the opportunity of digital transformation to become more resilient and have growth opportunities. So I'm actually quite optimistic about the potential in a way that hasn't existed, until very recently. Would you?
One of the dilemmas always about aid is that aid is about power relationships, and the Pacific knows that, I think, more than any. And so there's two aspects of that I'd like to respond with. The first is that we can't look at the trade issues specifically in the Pacific context without looking at the other challenges, and those challenges include the impacts of climate change and a real commitment to dealing with those issues. The issues around migration, which have pros and cons and are very complex, and I know that you've been doing some work around those issues as well. Issues around who controls resources such as fisheries, what the rules around fisheries are, not just dealing with fisheries subsidies, but dealing with the issues of Pacific rights in relation to fisheries. And many of the problems around funding of infrastructure. And so I think we have to always be putting trade into that broader context of the challenges that confront the Pacific. And as someone who worked for many, many years on PICTA and PACER and PACER Plus and the Pacific EPA, that is where the power relations became, I think, quite outrageous in the way that our governments operated. And the outcome is nothing towards development. It is power plays of big brothers behaving very badly in what they consider to be their lake. And so if we're going to deal with the aid and the trade relationships, we have to shift our behaviour towards communities in the Pacific. And that includes how we deal with the digital issues. It really worries me when I hear anecdotes about villages or anecdotes about how SMEs are going to be able to sell their stuff on digital platforms. UNCTAD has done some really excellent work, the Trade and Development limb of UNCTAD, analysing what some of the impacts on developing countries and especially on small island states will be. Of some of these digital changes, and especially what some of the changes in the proposed e-commerce rules will be. If you have removal of customs duties on electronic transmissions, and those electronic transmissions increase significantly, the revenues that come into those countries are going to be significantly hit. If you think you're going to be able to sell your SME products globally on a digital platform, you have to remember who controls the digital platforms. They are not open and free. They are manipulators, and they are now becoming notorious even in some of the larger countries. And finally, they control the data. And there's been very little talk about who controls data in this conference. Control of data is control of everything digital. And if you cannot, as countries, control your own data, you are dependent on what those who have the data do with it. And so I think this is part of a bigger conversation, that when you're talking about digitization and when you're talking about development and aid in the Pacific, especially in this new era, it has to be a bigger conversation.
May I just comment on that? I'm hoping that later on today we might hear from Hozuk Lee Makiyama about some fascinating work that his think tank has been doing on the moratorium on electronic transmissions, because the work that they have looked at has found that in fact the tariff revenues from that would be trivial and vastly outweighed by the cost to GDP of imposing tariffs on electronic transmissions. And on the question of the control of data, again, analysis that they've done shows that there are, in the order of 1% of GDP losses from restricting cross-border data flows. So I'm not sure it's quite as black and white as saying that, those are pro-development moves. In fact, the economic analysis suggests rather the opposite.
Well, the UNCTAD Trade and Development Report from last year has a whole chapter, and UNCTAD has several detailed papers analysing those statistics.
I do want a question from the floor. Okay, so we'll take, we're probably only going to get one in, so I didn't actually see who went first. Mike is coming behind you.
So I just want to make a small kind of comment in reaction to Professor Kelsey's discussion. I know nothing about the Pacifica, so I can't react to your specific comments on that. But I just wanted to contextualize a little bit how economists think about this whole thing, and where I think we did fall down a little bit in the last 10 years. So I like Pascal Aimé, a French socialist who used to run the WTO. He said, trade works because it's painful, and it's painful because it works. It essentially reallocates people from uncompetitive positions to more competitive positions. That's a painful thing. And the way the economics profession had dealt with that, which is something we all have drilled into us with the Stoper-Samuelson effect, is that trade openness must be met with complementary domestic policies to take care of people. And what I would like to just add here is that it's important that these aren't tied to trade, because you never know what's causing the changes. Is it taste? Is it generation? Is it aging? Is it climate change? Is it technology? And so the idea that a trade agreement has to be linked to a particular policy, I think, is a flawed way of government. You should have governments looking after workers, not jobs, and trade agreements trying to lead efficiency. So that's the end of my speech there. But I do know that the thing is that we as trade economists stop talking about the domestic complementary policies that we need to match with it, even in Europe, where they used to go hand in hand, the single market, doubling the regional funds, et cetera, things like that. So that was a falling down. Now I have actually a small specific question. In Belgium, the central bank has access to value-added data, which finds that the number of countries actually companies exporting is much larger than the headline figure. So the headline figures we have with the last sort of Mellitz kind of literature is about 90% of the exports are done by 10% of the firms. But with a value-added tax, you could see which Belgian firms are selling to the exporters. So that's the friends of the friends. And the friends of the friends of the friends, once you did that, 80% of the firms in Belgium were exporting, even though they didn't own the product as they left. Now, any country with a value-added tax data can figure that out, because you have the numbers of the exporters and you have all the value-added tax transactions. So the last point is on eBay data. So in eBay, 80% of the firms are exporting, which is exactly the opposite of real world. And the reason is because what eBay is not exporting. eBay is putting a product in a shopping mall, and the consumers pay the cost of going to the shopping mall. And once they're there, it's almost costless to search around. And if there's something about the data that matters, it's the algorithms that match consumers to products or help you search. So that's perhaps where one should worry about your point about the data. It's not the data, it's really the algorithms which are matching. So I'll just leave it there. Thanks.
So I think this is probably the last question to keep to time. So maybe we'll start with you, Professor Kelsey, and move back this way.
Okay, 3 quick points. There are heterodox economists who have different views from those that you expressed. That includes high-profile economists such as Dani Roderick, Joe Stiglitz, and a range of others who can't be written off quite as easily as a law professor might. We need to start thinking that this model is not the only model, point 1. Point 2, we need to stop using trade in a way that not only deals with commodity trade. I have problems with trade in services, and I'm a services girl from 1990. But we certainly need to understand that when we're talking about trade agreements and we're claiming the benefits of those agreements, we're talking in the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement context of 30 chapters, about 5 of which are about real trade. So that's my second point. And my third point is that, yes, algorithms and source codes are hugely important. They're important for competition law, for human rights law, for a whole range of issues around profiling and distortions and so on. So why are we signing up to agreements that are providing for the secrecy of source codes and the non-requirement of disclosure of source codes? And in the USMCA, the non-disclosure of algorithms. Who is going to have the power, not just over the data, but the source codes and the algorithms under those rules?
I don't have much to say on what Richard just pointed out, except that indeed we try to expand that analysis based on value added and access to firm level data, and indeed there is more than what you can see with a naked eye from standard official statistics. In fact, trade has much more direct and indirect participants in a cross-cutting study that we managed to do with OECD. If you, as I said, if you look at plain vanilla statistics, you would see that 1/3 of European exports, as you have them in nominal terms in Eurostat, are generated by SMEs. Switch to value added, and you will see that more than 50% of the value added contained in European exporters is actually produced by SMEs. Zoom in and try to look at a couple of sectors, say agri-food, beverages, furniture, elements, that sort of thing. And then you will see that even in a very large, mature environment with very big players, where you would expect many companies with more than 20 employees to dominate the marketplace. In these particular sectors that I just mentioned, you would see that more than 50 to 60%, more than 60% in some cases of the total exports are generated even in Europe by SMEs. Now imagine if you would then zoom even further and you go to a country like Estonia. I think in Estonia we'll see that the vast majority of players and kind of activity that is generated in that small economy, it is by SME. So to me, this is the first quick win, and something that should be already relegated to a kind of discussion of the past, is to question that trade has a direct impact on many, many small firms. It does, and it should be by now unquestionable.
So thank you, everyone. I'd like to thank our panelists once more. And thank you all for being a very engaged and active audience. There were over 40 questions in Slido, so we couldn't get to all of them. But if we could just thank our panellists once more, and then we'll take our seats again. Thank you.